Hello, my name is Jacqueline Guest, and welcome to our virtual book talk. Today, I would like to speak with you about my book called The Comic Book War. This is a great book for grades 6 through 9, and it will talk about what things were like here in Canada during World War II. The Comic Book War is the story of Robert Turand, a young man who has 3 brothers fighting overseas in World War II. He is very worried about his brothers and would do anything to protect them. When Robert was out walking one evening in Nose Hill Park, he suddenly sees a meteorite land in front of him. He finds the meteorite and takes it home. And right after that, strange things start to happen on the pages of his comic books. His comic book superheroes start to communicate with him. They start to show him what is happening to his 3 brothers who are fighting overseas. Now, Robert doesn't believe it because this is impossible, right? But then letters come from the front, from his brothers, and they say the same things that his comic books have already showed him that have happened overseas. So Robert starts to think, you know what, maybe if his comic books can communicate with him, maybe his superheroes had the power to protect his brothers. Robert sets out to figure out a way that he can buy all 3 comic book superheroes every month. 3 editions every month will come out, and if he buys them, he's sure his comic book superheroes will protect his brothers. But the problem is, it's 1943. There's not a lot of jobs around for a teenage boy. Now you have to understand, in World War II, Canada had a lot going on at home to protect the troops, to make sure they had all the guns, the ammunition, the uniforms, the tools of war, the machines of war. They all came from here in Canada, built by Canadians and sent overseas to help our soldiers fighting. One of the things we had here were victory gardens. People would rip up their lawns, their flower beds, and they would plant vegetables. They would plant their own food so that the other food could go to the soldiers overseas. Another thing we had here in Canada during World War II was rationing. Rationing means that before you could go to the store and maybe buy a steak for supper, you had to have special stamps in order to buy that food. And you were only allowed so much every week. For instance, I have a list here. You were allowed 8 ounces of sugar per week. You were allowed 1.5 pounds of meat per week. And you were allowed 6 ounces of butter per week. But that's all, and you had to have the stamps to buy this food. Now, other things were rationed, like gasoline, rubber cars. All of these things that could be turned into the machines of war were rationed. But they also had drives. They would have scrap drives to collect aluminum, to collect steel. They would have rubber drives to collect rubber that would be turned into tires for airplanes. But they also had a very peculiar drive going on. They had fat drives. Fat was very important during World War II. Now we're talking cooking fat, things that you get when you cook bacon and you cook up your meals on the stove. This was a very important commodity during World War II. It's explained in the Comic Book War, and you won't believe why they needed fat. Now, something else was going on during World War II. We had something called the War Measures Act. During World War II, nothing was allowed into Canada that wasn't important to the war effort. Now, comic books were certainly not important to the war effort, and so they were stopped at the border. Imagine, no Superman, no Batman was allowed into Canada. Canadian kids had no comic books to read, and this was in a time when there were no TVs, there were not very many radios around, and so all of a sudden, Canada's very own comic book industry sprung up overnight, and we had our own comic book superheroes. We had Canada Jack, and we had Captain Canuck, and we had Nelvana of the Northern Lights. Nelvana was a very special superhero. She was in fact a female superheroine, and she had superpowers. She could see with her very important cyber vision. She was ahead of her time because you know what? Nelvana of the Northern Lights was not only a female superheroine, she was the female superheroine. The first female superhero in the world, and she was a Canadian invention, and not many people know about that. So Our hero Robert, when he is busy taking this meteorite home and seeing his heroes show what's happening to his brothers overseas, he decides if he buys all 3 of his superheroes every month, they will keep his brothers safe. But in order to do this, he's going to have to get a job. Now, there weren't a lot of jobs in World War II for teenagers. The only job Robert can get is as a CPR telegram delivery boy. During World War II, telegrams were how important messages were communicated. They're like the text messages of the day. These telegrams would be delivered by boys on bicycles who would ride around, in this case Calgary, and deliver the telegrams. And they were expected to stand there and watch the lady read the telegram and make sure she was okay, because often these telegrams were war telegrams. These were the telegrams that began with, "We regret to inform you." And they were messages to tell a wife, a mother, that her son was dead, that the wife's husband had been killed in action, and the telegram delivery boy was expected to stand there and watch the lady read the telegram, and then if she dissolved into tears and became hysterical, he was supposed to go next door and bring the neighbor lady over to comfort her. So Robert has got one of these jobs as a delivery boy of these telegrams. The book goes through his discovering this job, discovering his comic books, but the book isn't all grim and all negative. It has a lot of fun elements in it, and I would like to read to you a little bit about how the book began, to give you an idea of what this book is like. It starts with this in the prologue. "It streaked from the farthest reaches of an unknown galaxy, a silver sword, carving the limitless night sky. Our hero stared, unable to move, unable to hide, as the brilliant interstellar visitor burned its way toward him." Now, what Robert is seeing is this. This is the meteorite that Robert actually finds that night on Nose Hill Park. And right after he finds this meteorite, the strange things start to happen in his comic books. Now, that was a very dark time. There was a lot of very negative things that happened during World War II. And one of the things happened was that Poland was overrun. It was one of the first countries overrun in World War II. And so many people, many refugees, came to Canada where it was safe. One of these refugees became a neighbor of Robert's. His name was Teddy Glowinski. And one night, Robert decides to go over and visit his neighbor, Teddy. And this is what happens. One night after supper, Robert noticed the light was on in Mr. Glowinski's workshop. Robert had been too busy to see his friend in a while, and after all the miles he'd put on his wheeled wonder this last week, his chain could really use some oil. It was a good time to drop by. He walked over and let himself in the side door to the shop. "Hey, Mr. Glowinski, I was wondering if you had any chain lube. I'm really running up the miles on my bike." Time stopped as Robert's mind tried to make sense of what he saw. Mr. Glowinski stood illuminated by the pale glow of the yellow overhead light. His face was haggard, gray, and drawn, and his tortured eyes were red-rimmed. In his hand was a pistol. The barrel rested against his temple. Terrible things happened in the war, and some of those things you couldn't get past them. Things that happened to Mr. Glowinski were simply too much for him, overwhelmed him, and if it weren't for Robert, things could have gone very badly. But this book isn't all dark and negative. At one point in the book, Robert, our telegram delivery boy, must deliver one of those telegrams to his favorite teacher. And this is what happens when Robert delivers the telegram. The north wind was unusually bitter and stung Robert's face as he made his way through the dark, icy streets. He tried to think of what he would say or how he'd be able to help when his teacher read the terrible news he was carrying. Steeling himself against what was coming, Robert knocked. His teacher opened the door with a cigarette in one side of her mouth. Her hair was tangled in big curlers that reminded him of soup cans, and she had green goop slathered all over her face. "Howdy, Robert." Her cheerful reaction quickly changed Robert figured she must be imagining how she looked to a student. My goodness, Robert, you've caught me at a kind of an awkward moment. She touched her face and her fingers came away green. Telegram for Miss Alice Pettigrew. Robert tried to sound very professional and solemn. He'd seen how folks dissolved when they read these things and wanted to give the situation the gravity it deserved. Pencil-drawn eyebrows furrowed in confusion. Then he held up the envelope, and comprehension flooded Miss Pettigrew's face as she recognized his uniform. "You'd better come in." Stepping back, she swung the door wide. Robert walked into the warm apartment, then held out his delivery book for her to sign. He discovered that once folks had their telegram, everything else was forgotten, like signing his book, and he'd have to explain to Mr. Crabtree why he had no proof of delivery. She ripped open the telegram, and Robert watched her closely. Next, she sat down hard on the chair by the door. "I don't believe it." Robert waited for the inevitable. This is... She took the cigarette she'd been puffing out of her mouth and blew a smoke ring into the air. Robert was ready to get a neighbor. "This is fabulous," she squealed in a very undevastated way. This was not what he'd expected. Either the news wasn't a death notice, or his teacher was wackier than he'd thought. Now, the comic book war leads us to think about how we're all connected. It leads us to think about how we need to support each other, how we need to help our neighbors and our friends. And for me, the comic book war is one of my favorite books, and I hope you enjoy reading it from your local library. This is Jacqueline Guest saying thank you very much for coming to my virtual book talk today.